In the quiet of an estate walled off from the city, a little girl lived as if the sun belonged to someone else. Everyone said she could not see, and the household arranged its days around that belief. The father kept the gates shut and the curtains drawn, the lights dimmed to the softest glow, and the house moved like a careful prayer. For years, doctors and specialists visited, left reports with signatures and stamps, and left the family to its routines. Then one day, a new maid arrived and noticed a sliver of behavior someone else had called meaningless. That sliver would become the thread that unraveled a secret no one expected. If you follow stories where truth emerges from small acts of attention, stay with us. Subscribe if you like this kind of investigation. What would you do if the life of someone you love depended on looking twice at what everyone else took for granted? Victor Ames was a man who knew how to buy silence. He had built his fortune in real estate and investment, and with his money he had learned to shape the world inside his walls. After his wife died in a hospital hallway 10 years earlier, he retreated into a pattern of protection that felt like love and ended up looking like control. He hired tutors, therapists, and the best specialists the country could offer. He kept the doctors on retainer and the home staff on a schedule that allowed no surprises. Victor believed he was doing everything for Elena. He watched the little girl's life shrink and expand under rules he thought were necessary. The backstory of his choices was not a simple tale of cruelty or malice. In private, he replayed the night of the accident, the sterile smell of the emergency room, the way the doctors pronouncing a diagnosis had sounded final. In public, he was generous with donations and polite at charity events. But in the home, he moved like a man trying to prevent the same pain from coming back. He had lost trust in anyone outside the house after a string of medical missteps. The staff he trusted most became proxies for his fear. Friends called him devoted, colleagues called him powerful. To the girl he loved, he was both protector and warden. Elena lived half of each day in a dim sitting room by the east window, and the other half in a bedroom lined with soft rugs and heavy curtains. She held an old brown bear with one button eye and hummed in a way that did not match the music from the living room. She had been diagnosed as blind when she was tiny, and the diagnosis shaped how everyone treated her. Sensory cues were limited. There were soft textiles everywhere, muted colors, the sound of a clock that ticked with a measured calm. The staff moved like trained instruments, their footsteps muffled on rugs, their voices low and cautious. There was Nurse Crassa, Rosa, who came each morning to give pills and eye drops. There was Dr. Alvarez, who made a quarterly visit and left pages of unreadable notes on a desk. There was Anna the cook, Paulo the gardener, Detective Marcus, who was unofficially consulted once when a complaint was made, and Lila, the family's longtime house manager, who kept keys to every locked drawer. The household had rhythms: soft food at noon, music practice in the afternoon, story time before bed. Elena rarely left the property. She did not attend school. She had no friends outside the staff. The world beyond the gates seemed dangerous, and that was the narrative the father had chosen to believe. The child showed signs that, to a casual observer, were small and inconsistent. Sometimes her palms would lift to follow a warm light falling across a table. Sometimes she reached for a ribbon when someone moved a hand near her face. To many, these were random reflexes, easily explained by habit or imagination. To Maria, who arrived on a rainy Tuesday to clean and fold clothes, they were clues. Maria had grown up in a crowded flat where she had learned to read faces as exactly as others read books. She had a way of letting quiet things take shape. On her second morning, she saw Elena tilt her head toward the sound of the kettle long before the steam touched her face. The kettle hissed under the faint kitchen lamp. Maria smelled lemon cleaner and wet wool, and remembered the first time she had known a child could surprise an adult by what they noticed. She watched Elena in short bursts, keeping distance in case her curiosity was naive. Her attention caught small changes: the faint shimmer of a droplet on a napkin, The way Elena's fingers cradled the bear differently when a shaft of light crossed the rug. The sound of pages turning slower when the radio played a high-pitched note. She heard the soft click of a vial being opened in the morning, a sound so quick it was almost the heartbeat of the house. The staff were used to routines and explanations that fit the official file. They spoke in guarded phrases. "It is best for her," Nurse Rosa would say. "We follow the orders," Dr. Alvarez said once when Maria asked a practical question and received a tight smile. The tension of the household lived in the pauses and unfinished sentences. Maria introduced herself in the smallest way a new person can. "Hello, Elena. I am Maria," she said the first afternoon, offering a damp washcloth folded into a square. Elena's fingers pressed against the cloth and lingered. Maria smelled soap and rain and felt the coolness of the cloth between her own palms. "She likes textures," Anna the cook said from the doorway, her voice thin with curiosity. Maria asked simple questions to those who had worked in the house longer. "How long has she been on these?"
"Drops?" she asked Nurse Rosa, who paused and adjusted a folded linen. "Since she was a baby," Rosa replied, eyes steady. "They make her eyelids quiet." Maria did not react to the phrase quiet eyelids as a metaphor. She catalogued sounds, the rhythm of steps in the corridor, the metallic clink of vials in a morning tray. She noticed that Dr. Alvarez left his briefcase in the same place, and that Leela, who kept the schedule, always closed a specific cabinet after the morning round. Curiosity grew into a plan, not of confrontation, but of observation. Maria waited for moments when the house lowered its guard, when the father left for meetings, when the gardener paused with a broken hedge, when the clock's pendulum offered a predictable rhythm. She began to test small things within the house, questions posed as chores. "May I bring in a lamp?" she asked one evening. "It will help with sewing," she lied. Inside her pocket, she kept a small flashlight whose light was brighter than the household lamps. The first test came by accident when she dropped the flashlight and the beam slid across the floor, creating a pale stripe of illumination. Elena turned her head toward the stripe with a slow, intentional motion. Maria gasped a little at the sound of her own breath, the smell of old polish sharp in her mouth. "Did you see that?" Maria asked Leela later, voice low. Leela folded napkins with thumbs that trembled. "Children sometimes do odd things," Leela said. The phrase hung between them like a thin curtain of caution. Maria's first deliberate experiment was quiet and careful. She sat across from Elena in the sitting room, the curtains open a sliver to let daylight coax the room into color. She placed a small mirror on a table and adjusted it so sunlight flickered into soft pulses. The room smelled of lemon and dust. The mirror caught a ray and sent it to Elena's face as if by accident. Elena's lashes fluttered, then held. Her fingers traced the air. Maria reached for a small metallic charm from her apron, its coolness firm and familiar in her hand. She let it glint once, then stilled. Elena's lips moved without sound, as if forming a word she could not say. Maria documented everything in a notebook later, each note smelling faintly of the paper and the ink that bled just where sunlight touched it. That night, Maria told only one person, Paolo the gardener, on his lunch break under the olive tree. "She turned toward the light," Paolo said slowly, wiping soil from his hands. "What does that mean?" Maria asked. "It means someone should look again," Paolo said, and left for more pruning with his hands still dusty. The first small proof grew in Maria's mind into a possibility that rose like steam from the kettle she had heard that morning. The discovery was accidental in its visibility, but intentional in the way Maria framed it. She began to keep a log with times and tiny actions, pairing sounds with movements and smells with responses. She recorded an instance where the dropper bottle made a small vibration on contact, and Elena blinked as if startled by a sound. She noted a certain brand of eye drops delivered in glass vials wrapped in white tissue and placed in a locked box behind Leela's desk. She heard the clink when Leela placed the lid, and she smelled the faint medicinal perfume of the vials. Her list grew into a pattern that did not make sense if Elena were truly blind. Maria shared the list with Nurse Rosa in a way that asked for explanation, not accusation. "Why are there so many bottles?" Maria asked, showing care and steady eyes. Rosa's hands held a tray, the porcelain warm from recent washing. "They are medicine," Rosa said. "They help her." Maria asked where the prescriptions were kept. Rosa looked toward the study where Victor kept his papers and then said nothing. She wrote dates in the margin of her notebook and left for the laundry room with a plate of consolation, as if the world could be soothed by small acts of domestic kindness. The first overt sign that something was off came when Maria found an old clinic envelope in the trash can. It had Dr. Alvarez's name and a code scribbled on the back. The envelope smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. When Maria asked about it, Leela shut her eyes for a beat and said, "Those are private records. Please do not touch them." The phrase was a door that Maria pushed a finger into. At roughly 33% into what would become an unfolding fight for truth, we want to pause and ask you something. If you are feeling shocked and hopeful at the same time, you are not alone. We want to invite you to take a small action here with us. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you found evidence that could change a life. Would you first look for professional help? Would you speak to the family? Or would you hold the evidence until you understood more? Start your reply with one of these options so your answer is easy to find. Your words matter because they create a map for other viewers who may be living through something difficult and do not know where to begin. When you write, consider telling us if you would trust the medical system or a community aid organization first. Your perspective could guide someone to a trusted resource. We read and share your comments with care. Now that you have spoken, let us continue with what happened after Maria chose to find a specialist outside the household. After the comments and the small community of watchers weighed in, Maria sought outside expertise. She reached out to Dr. Elena Moreno, a pediatric neurologist known for working with sensory development. Maria wrote an email and then placed a call, her fingers trembling with the same rhythm as when she had first seen the beam of light cross the rug. Dr. Moreno agreed to a discreet home visit under the pretense of a routine consultation. In their first conversation, Dr. Moreno asked direct clinical questions and Maria answered with the log in her hand. The specialist listened and then proposed a set of simple observational tests designed to determine responsiveness: controlled light exposure, low-frequency sounds, scent cues, and tactile tracking tasks. Each test was simple to perform and non-invasive. Dr. Moreno explained the rationale in clear terms. Responsiveness to light or sound could indicate residual visual or auditory processing and not absolute sensory loss. This explanation, followed by an agreed-upon plan, gave Maria a professional scaffold to present to the family. The doctor emphasized that the tests were preliminary and that a full assessment would require clinic-based equipment if anything unexpected emerged. The house smelled of lemon and damp towels the day Dr. Moreno arrived. She carried a small kit in a soft case, some portable tools, and a handheld device that produced patterns of light without overwhelming the room. Paolo, who had been watching from the hedges, opened the gate like a slow breath. He smelled the city air and the earth on his palms and felt the sun press warm against the soil. In the room, doctor, maid, and gardener formed a quiet coalition of attention. The first round of tests was choreography disguised as care. They dimmed the house lamps and Maria held a tiny LED lamp under the pretense of needlework. The light was cool and white and bright enough to create reflections on the worn wood table. Elena sat on the rug clutching her bear. The room registered the smell of lemon cleaner and closed windows, the soft creak of the rocking chair, and the distant hum of the refrigerator. The LED beam crossed Elena's face in controlled intervals. Dr. Moreno asked her to track the pattern and recorded response with a small notepad. "Look at the little light," Maria murmured in a voice like a promise. Elena's eyelids fluttered and then turned in a slow arc toward the lamp. Dr. Moreno's pen paused. They tried a scent pattern next, a cotton pad dabbed with lavender and then another with citrus. Elena responded differently to each scent, making subtle mouth shapes and turning her head as if mapping a path in air. They tested sound by clapping softly behind a cloth and by playing a low-frequency hum. Each cue produced a trace of directed movement. The house seemed to inhale. "She is responding in ways inconsistent with a diagnosis of total blindness," Dr. Marino said quietly. Maria felt the fur of the bear under her thumb and her heartbeat tighten. The tests had been mindful and calm so as not to alarm the staff or the father. They produced an observation, a verdict. Maria filmed small clips with a concealed phone to create records. She smelled nails and wet plaster in the study where the father had conversations. Later, she took those clips to Dr. Moreno, who reviewed them under bright clinic lights and then spoke about the need for biochemical analysis and medication review. The next step was to document the medications present in the house and analyze their contents. Maria found a storage box with several vials and bottles. They were labeled with a name and a small code. The vials smelled medicinal, sharp at first, then underlying floral notes from the cleaning agents around them. Dr. Moreno insisted on sending samples to an independent lab. The process required careful chain of custody to be valid in any legal forum. First, they photographed each item, noting batch numbers and any residue. Then they sealed samples in sterile containers and recorded who handled them, when, and where. Chain of custody was a legal technique to maintain the integrity of evidence by documenting each transfer from one person to another, including timestamps and signatures. This method ensured that any later testing would be defensible in court. Maria felt the weight of the vials in her palm and the hum of possibility in her ears. In a letter to the lab, they requested a toxicology analysis focused on active compounds that could affect eye function and sensory processing. The request was specific: identify substances in the eye drop formulations and test for off-label compounds. The lab asked for 48 hours to run chromatography and mass spectrometry analyses. In the meantime, the household continued to simulate normalcy, and the vials remained sealed in a locked safe under Paulo's temporary watch. Laboratory analysis revealed anomalies. The report from the independent lab arrived in an envelope that smelled faintly of toner and antiseptic. It listed active ingredients expected in common ocular lubricants and then noted traces of a central nervous system depressant not declared in the prescriptions. The lab explained the detection technique in clinical language and then in plain terms. The chromatograph separated the components, and a mass spectrum matched known signatures of a restricted compound that was not indicated for ocular use. The result suggested exposure to an agent that could suppress visual responses or alter sensory perception. The finding was technical, but the implication was immediate. Maria read the report at a kitchen table that smelled of coffee and warm bread while Paulo watched from the doorway. She felt the paper tremble in her hands. The document contained numbers and peaks and signatures, but it was the plain sentence at the bottom that made the breath leave her body. Presence of undeclared compounds consistent with agents capable of altering sensory responsiveness. The word undeclared echoed across memories of clinical envelopes thrown away and a locked cabinet with boxes of vials. Maria knew this was no ordinary medical oversight. She had, in a quiet way, put a flashlight to a small hole. Corner of the house and found a pattern that suggested systematic misuse of treatment. When they presented the findings to Victor, the father, the confrontation was heavy with history. Victor sat at the end of his long table with palms pressed into one another. His suit smelt faintly of cologne and expensive laundry. "How could this happen?" he asked in a voice that held both accusation and disbelief. Maria showed him the recordings and the lab report. "I only did what I thought was best," he said, jaw grinding. "The doctors told me these treatments were necessary." Dr. Alvarez, summoned in a protective gesture, read the report and spoke slowly.
Some medications are given systemically and have off-label compounds in certain formulations that can be misinterpreted, he said in a tone that attempted calm. Detective Marcus arrived after a call from Dr. Moreno, and he listened with an official patience. "We will need statements and records," he said. The house felt colder as the conversation expanded. Paulo paced near a window, and Anna sat with a dish towel in her lap. Leela, who had guarded the files, looked at the floor as if the wood could tell her what to say. The first real burst of tension came when Victor's voice rose, and Elena, who had been sleeping in another room, started calling out softly. A neighbor, Mrs. Ortega, came to the door asking if everything was all right, and then retreated when she saw the grouped faces through the glass. The family line between protection and secrecy split with the argument. Victor accused Maria of betrayal. Maria replied with careful words and then an unsteady explanation of what had led her to the lab. "I only wanted to help Elena," she said. "She is a child who deserved another look." There was a moment when Victor's hands trembled and he covered his face with both palms. He did not know yet whether his trust had been misplaced or whether he had been right to keep the world away. The legal process began in a cautious way. Detective Marcus opened a preliminary inquiry, and the district attorney assigned an investigator. They took witness statements from Maria, Dr. Moreno, Nurse Rosa, Leela, and Paulo. The chain of custody documentation became central to whether the vials could be introduced in a formal hearing. The DA requested copies of the prescriptions and asked for medical records from Dr. Alvarez. In parallel, a child welfare advocate named Attorney Green was appointed to make sure Elena's rights were represented. Media began asking questions, but Victor's lawyers requested privacy. Journalist Leela Caldwell, a reporter known for careful pieces about medical ethics, made a discreet call to the DA to confirm that an investigation was in progress. The scene outside the estate swelled with curiosity. Reporters scanned hedges, and neighbors whispered. Threats came in two forms: quiet calls to Maria suggesting she had broken a family trust, and formal letters from Victor's legal team asking people not to disseminate confidential documents. The pressure was both social and systemic. The family faced accusations and a public that wanted answers. The staff grew protective of Elena in new ways. Nurse Rosa, who had been part of the routine for a decade, now found herself under scrutiny. She spoke at one point to Detective Marcus with a voice like wet cloth. "I have always followed orders," she said. "They told me what to apply and when to apply. I never thought to question it." Maria watched the small gestures of repentance and fear like a catalog of human complexity. In the core dramatic confrontation, Maria, Victor, Dr. Alvarez, Detective Marcus, Nurse Rosa, Paulo, Leela, and Anna were in the same room. The air felt thin. Voices rose in a measured crescendo. The scene contained the most intense emotional compression of the story. "Why did no one tell me?" Victor cried. "I was told she could not be helped." Maria answered first with a soft voice. "I saw light move across her face, and she followed it," she said. Dr. Alvarez's face went pale. "The formulations are standard," he said, sounding small. Detective Marcus placed a notebook on the table and wrote names like an anchor. "We are not here to assign guilt yet," he said. "We need facts." There was an exchange of questions and answers that lasted long enough to break and then mend itself with each reply. "Why were the prescriptions so frequent?" Marcus asked. "Can you produce medical orders?" he asked. Rosa said that the orders came from the files, which were maintained by the house manager. Lila, who had locked the records, explained that she was following orders from the father, who had the final say. "I thought I was protecting Elena," Lila said. Victor felt the weight of accusation and the sharpness of guilt. He had acted out of fear, and his fear had made a room of silence. Maria watched Elena across the room and noticed the way the child's hands found the seam of the rug with an intentionality that suggested learning.
Elena moved, came closer, and placed her hand on Maria's knee, as if to offer a bridge. That small touch calmed some of the anger in the room, like a cool glass of water balancing a fever. The medical expert testimony that followed was technical and precise. Dr. Moreno explained in clinical terms the results of the tests and the lab analysis. She then described how certain compounds, when used improperly in ocular formulations, can lead to altered sensory response. The explanation was concise and to the point. Some agents depress neural signaling, she said. When applied repeatedly to ocular tissue or administered systemically, they can reduce reactive behaviors and mimic sensory loss. She elaborated on the typical testing methods by describing a standard ophthalmologic exam, visual evoked potentials, and pharmacological screenings. In brief, an ophthalmologic exam assesses the physical structures of the eye. Visual evoked potentials measure electrical responses in the brain after light stimulus, and pharmacological screens test for active agents and their concentrations in biological samples. The DA allowed the report into the record and requested a follow-up to determine liability. These procedural notes are important to understand how the case moved from suspicion to a formal inquiry and how the medical language translated into legal categories. The media reaction was swift and polarizing. Some reports portrayed Victor as a negligent father, others as a victim who had been misled by professionals. Opinion pieces debated whether a culture of deference to authority in matters of health had played a role. Leila Caldwell wrote a careful piece outlining the sequence of events and interviewing child welfare advocates about the ethical problems raised. Her article quoted Attorney Green and included contextual information about the regulation of medical compounds and the importance of independent audits. Social media, predictably, condensed the story into moral stands and hashtags. Supporters of Maria raised funds and messages of solidarity. Others criticized her for breaking trust. The family found itself in the eye of a storm. There were threats, petitions, and, unexpectedly, offers of help from local foundations wishing to support Elena's rehabilitation. In court, the negotiation of truth required documentation and testimony. The prosecution pointed to the lab results and to clinical recordings. The defense argued that the compounds could be present due to contamination or improper labeling and requested further testing. Dr. Alvarez testified that he had prescribed only approved compounds but that compounding pharmacies can make errors. The testimony of Nurse Rosa and Leila about the routine of administration introduced human complexity. Detective Marcus cross-referenced time logs and the chain of custody. The judge asked for a careful reconstruction of events and a list of responsible parties. The legal back and forth exposed how medical practice, family power dynamics, and institutional trust can intersect in painful ways. The courtroom smelt faintly of coffee and paper, and the air felt layered with the weight of decisions. The argument about intent versus negligence was the central pivot. If someone had intentionally used a substance to keep Elena unresponsive, the penal consequences would be different than if a neglectful system and poor oversight led to chronic exposure. After the first legal steps, the family made an immediate decision to stop all non-essential medications pending a full clinical evaluation. The change was instant in some ways and slow in others. Elena began a regimen of sensory rehabilitation under Dr. Moreno and a team of therapists. Their approach combined visual stimulation, auditory mapping, and tactile training in compassionate increments. Within days, small changes emerged. Elena followed a ribbon offered by a therapist with a gentle, deliberate tracking movement. She reached for a toy when a high contrast pattern was shown. The first visible sign that the house might be moving toward repair came when she smiled at a sunbeam that entered the sitting room and pointed it out with a small, excited sound. Victor sat near the window and watched like a man witnessing a miracle he had not allowed himself to imagine. The emotional confrontation had transformed into a daily labor of attention. Paulo and Anna formed part of the support. Paulo created small garden paths so Elena could learn spatial navigation by texture. and Anna adapted meals to larger plates with color contrast. Nurse Rosa enrolled in retraining sessions, and Dr. Alvarez faced disciplinary proceedings. Maria found herself at the center of a group that had, in small acts of observation, forced a path toward care that prioritized the child. The case reached moments with viral impact. The first high emotional spike happened when Elena uttered a word that had been feared lost. She looked at Maria one afternoon and in a clear, small voice said, "Mama," meaning something like mother and longing. The sound echoed across the household and across the feeds weeks later when a short clip was released by the family's new PR strategy that had been coordinated with the court's permissions. People who had followed the case reacted with tears and a rush of empathy. The courtroom drama that followed yet again put the medical practice of compounding pharmacies and the oversight of home care in the spotlight. Investigative journalists traced suppliers and examined whether compounding processes had adhered to regulations. One technical explanation that emerged during those inquiries involved the process of compounding eye formulations. Compounding requires precise ratios of active ingredients, sterile environments, and validated equipment. Any deviation can introduce off-label agents or alter concentrations, which, in delicate tissues like the eye, can have disproportionate effects. This explanation clarified how an error or malpractice could transition from a lab signature into a clinical condition. Simultaneously, social pressure changed the dynamics inside Victor's world. Prominent donors voiced concern, and some withheld contributions pending the outcome of investigations. A foundation offering support to children with sensory impairments reached out to offer therapy and schooling resources. The story became both a cautionary tale and a catalyst. Public hearings on home-administered medical treatments were scheduled, and regulators promised reviews of monitoring mechanisms for private care. The legal proceedings continued but were complemented by policy conversations. Names like Attorney Green, Dr. Moreno, Detective Marcus, Leela Caldwell the journalist, Paulo the gardener, Nurse Rosa, Anna the cook, Dr. Alvarez the specialist, and Victor himself moved from private individuals into roles within a public story. Each person carried pieces of a complicated moral map. The community outside the gates organized meetings about how to support families with complex medical needs and how to ensure oversight that protects children without stripping families of agency. In intimate moments, the family had to face internal repair. Victor attended therapy sessions organized by a child welfare agency to process his decisions. He spoke with humility about his fear and about how he had equated protection with control. "I thought I was shielding her from harm," he told a counselor, voice thick. "I did not want to risk making the wrong choice again." The counselor suggested restorative steps, including public apology where appropriate, and private actions such as allowing regular external evaluations. Elena's progress continued in a measured way. She began to attend a specialized school for children with visual and multisensory differences, where therapists used patterns of light and sound to help build neural pathways. Paolo and Anna volunteered to be part of her daily support network. Leela, who had been criticized for maintaining privacy, admitted that her loyalty had been misplaced and engaged in retraining. Dr. Alvarez faced an administrative review, and the compounding pharmacy was audited. Maria, who had been the unlikely catalyst, received offers of legal support and community recognition. She was both celebrated and condemned in different quarters. The most tender scenes were not in court or in newspapers, but in rooms where a child learned to reach and a father learned to watch without taking over. The epilogue shows how lives move forward in measurable times. 1 month later, Elena had begun weekly sensory sessions and showed modest but meaningful improvements. She followed moving objects with clearer intention and began to name shapes in a new therapy room that smelled of crayons and clean cotton. The father attended a support group and took the first steps to relinquish absolute control over medical decisions. Community volunteers had set up practical support, including a tutor named Hannah who specialized in sensory integration and an art therapist named Miguel who encouraged expression through touch and color. The family opened their home for a public meeting about oversight and committed to a transparent care plan with outside clinicians. 3 months later, the legal case had advanced to a formal hearing, and the pharmacy agreed to a settlement that included funding for Elena's rehabilitation and an independent audit of compounding practices. Elena was enrolled in a half-day program at a nearby school where she learned tactile maps and low vision aids. Her drawings began to show light and windows and figures that reached out. Public opinion softened in many quarters as the focus shifted from blame to prevention. The DA announced that disciplinary actions were being taken against providers who failed to maintain records. Foundations launched initiatives to support families needing oversight when professional care occurs at home. Maria visited Elena in the school and sat on a small bench, while the child reached out and traced the shape of Maria's knuckles with a young curiosity. 6 months later, Elena had made steady progress. She had a small circle of friends at school, her drawings were part of a local charity exhibit, and she had learned to read using a combination of high-contrast cards and tactile patterns. The family had restructured its approach to care. Victor had become an advocate for oversight in private home treatment and appeared at a public forum with Dr. Moreno to talk about the importance of independent assessments. The compounding pharmacy had implemented corrective changes and was subject to regulatory review. Maria had started a community program that trained domestic workers in basic observation and reporting skills, emphasizing the importance of respectful attention to children's behaviors. The household had reopened a gate to the neighborhood and organized a small fair where Elena and other children displayed art and the community shared food. The recovery had not erased the past, but it had created a new path with accountability and support at its center. Throughout this reconstruction, there were moments of high tension amplified into viral moments. The discovery of a child responding to light by a maid with few credentials disrupted assumptions about authority. The first clear word from Elena became a symbol of what attention can restore. The courtroom struggle revealed how professional responsibility and family trust can collide. The lab reports that linked compounds to altered sensory processing became evidence and a wake-up call about oversight in prepared medications. And finally, the public recognition and policy responses showed how a local case could prompt systemic change. Names stayed with us. Maria, the maid who noticed. Victor, the father who protected and then learned. Elena, the child who recovered voice and sight in small ways. Dr. Elena Moreno, the specialist who validated observations. Nurse Rosa, who acknowledged following orders. Lila, the house manager who guarded documents. Paolo, the gardener who offered practical kindness. Attorney Green, who defended the child's rights. Lila Caldwell, the journalist who brought public scrutiny. And Hannah, the tutor who helped rebuild skills. If this story moved you, share it with someone who values careful observation and compassion. We hope that the tale of a maid seeing what others did not becomes a reminder that attention matters, that systems can fail, and that accountability can lead to repair. Remember the small gestures that changed everything, the light crossing a rug and a hand reaching for a bear. If you want more stories where truth emerges from quiet acts of courage, subscribe to our channel and join our community. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and whether you would have spoken up in Maria's place. Your voice helps create safer spaces for children everywhere. Thank you for staying with us through this story and for believing that sometimes a simple act of attention is the first step toward justice and healing.